All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Kevin Maloney. I am the Director of Communications at Carnegie Council. So to begin, I'd like to welcome you all to the Council's Global Ethics Hub for the latest convening in our Unlocking Cooperation series. So today we're going to be examining how democracies can enhance multilateral cooperation as a means to more proactively and effectively counter authoritarian actors. An especially salient topic at a moment when governments and individuals are embracing nationalism and rejecting democratic norms. Our discussion will be moderated today by Jim Ketterer, a longtime friend of the Council, who currently serves as a senior fellow at Bard College. Alongside Jim, we're honored to welcome Christopher Walker from the National Endowment for Democracy, Tinatin Japaridze from Eurasia Group, and Sunny Cheung from the Jamestown Foundation. Each of these panelists bring to the gathering critical perspectives on the state of democracy today, both globally and across key regions. Before passing the microphone to Jim, and to help frame our conversation, I wanted to share a short quote from a recent article by Council President Joel Rosenthal, in which he discusses cooperation as an essential principle at the intersection of ethics and international affairs. Joel writes, "The commitment to international cooperation is a moral proposition because it goes to the essence of ethics, recognizing what is common for all, while managing the intrinsic and inevitable differences between and among people. To simply assert power is irresponsible and in the end counterproductive. To retreat entirely is also unprincipled and short-sighted." With that message, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Jim. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I'd like to thank the Carnegie Council for convening this very important conversation and for all the work that they do on so many important conversations. If this is your first time here at a Carnegie event, I highly recommend that you find ways to come back, that you find ways to be engaged with this organization. They make it easy because they're very engaging, and that's so important. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists who have all made their way here from Washington, D.C. to be here this morning, and all of you. You could be doing different things this morning, having coffee, having breakfast, taking your time, starting your day, but instead you're here. And I think it's critically important. It's always important that people be engaged in important topics, big ideas, serious conversations, and it may be more important now than ever. And this is certainly a very important topic. As I was making my way here this morning from the west side of Manhattan to the east side, which New Yorkers know are two really very different worlds, crossing the gap from one side to the other of the island, was headed into the beautiful sun. It's a beautiful day here in New York, and was just reminded that sunrises are beautiful things, but they can blind you as well. And it was hard to cross the street in a couple places, and it was making me think that we can be blinded to the details of a lot of things that are going on. And so we're here to talk about some of those details. And I was also thinking back on this topic, I was thinking back a few decades to that time following the end of the Cold War, before 9/11, when it seemed like there were so many possibilities. There was a sense of optimism. It may be hard to remember that, or for those of you who are young enough here to not know that, but I'm here to tell you that there really was this palpable sense of optimism, perhaps naivete, but there was a real sense that there were all kinds of possibilities that have, in one way or another, evaded our grasp. And so, as an opening question, as kind of a thought experiment, I'd like to maybe start with Sunny and just say, so if somebody from that time of some relative optimism were to time travel and appear today, and you had to brief them on where things stand now, what is the lay of the land and in the areas that you know well, but the whole world as well, and just not to limit it, what would you say to this time traveler?
Right. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me here. And secondly, if you celebrate the Lunar New Year, Happy Lunar New Year. So I wear red I mean, in respect to the culture, right? And then, so I think that's a very great question. So a little bit background of myself. I grew up and was raised in Hong Kong, and then so I witnessed how the Chinese government in recent decades has been destroying and undermining the autonomy of Hong Kong. And in case you haven't known the Hong Kong story already, so Hong Kong was a British colony. So if I got the opportunity to go back perhaps before 1997, which was the year Hong Kong being handed over from British to the Chinese, I would actually remind Hong Kong people and the world not to trust China blindly, because I think there was like optimism after the end of Cold War. So the liberalism and then could easily prevail, and then we should really engage with China and try to uphold the principle that, I mean, by introducing free market liberalism, and then that can also help China transform to a better state. And this is a very classic modernization theory, which is actually proven wrong, very unfortunately. And I will also say, when we try to examine China, we have to understand that the nature and the political regime of the current PRC, which they do not respect human rights, they do not believe in democracy, they believe in autocracy and try to centralize power, especially for Xi Jinping in recent years. And then in order to ensure that the whole PRC can actually become a state that actually try to stabilize not just the regional stability, but also the global stability. So if I could, have the chance to talk to the British government and try to tell them, well, actually the most of the time, before the handover, Hong Kong people actually, they also didn't want to go back to China, because after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, many people already lack the faith that the Chinese government could, have any meaningful political reform. So yes, try to give the self-determination right to Hong Kong people, because Hong Kong was one of the very rare case which was a British colony, but didn't ever have the self-determination right and no a public referendum to allow the Hong Kong people to decide their own future. So this is one thing. And secondly, of course, to talk to the US government at that period of time, because I think at that period of time, no matter it's under the President Bush or President Clinton in the 90s, they had a big debate here in Washington. They wondered if they should allow China to get into WTO. If, they argue if they should lift the sanction which was imposed against China after the Tiananmen massacre. Should they lift the sanction to give a good signal to China in order, in return, China can, actually also embrace the liberal order. But which again was proven wrong. So I would do a couple of things, but mainly just try to warn them to have a more holistic examination of the current state of China.
Okay, thank you very much, Tinatin. What would you say along these lines to a similar time traveler coming to you and maybe to parts of the world that you're most familiar with?
Thank you so much, Jim. And my very special thanks to the Carnegie Council. I was very fortunate to be a student ambassador here a few years ago now, and sat in this room where you're all sitting, our audience, quite a few times. So it really is an honor and a great privilege for me to be here with such a distinguished group of panelists. So thank you all for having me. Jim, it's really one of those questions that I would have answered very differently a year ago, compared to what I will be saying now, particularly when it comes to the country that I'm from, my native Georgia. Unfortunately, Georgia is going through a very concerning transition. And sadly, it's a transition towards something very negative as opposed to something positive that has been long overdue. And a lot of what we grew up with, my generation of millennials that were born at the tail end of the Soviet regime and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when there was so much hope. And we were so blinded, Jim, as you said, by that sunlight suddenly, that we thought this is it. And just because we had access to Western goods that were readily available to us, we thought that that was actually going to equal having access to democracy, a democratic future that has in many ways, without sounding cliche, been in our DNA as Georgians. I did spend many years, my formative years in Russia of the 90s, which of course was a very different Russia compared to the one today, Putin's Russia. And I can tell you that the 90s in Russia, that era of a lot of hope, perhaps naivete and unwillingness to think realistically about what would have to come next and why it was so crucial to start thinking about building and strengthening institutions, which many of us, my compatriots, dismissed as, again, a cliche, thinking, well, this is meaningless, we're fine, we have access to everything we need, we can travel abroad now, there is no Iron Curtain anymore, and therefore we started to dismiss these very critical issues that our partners, especially the United States, were warning us about for many years. And sadly, today, my native Georgia it does remind me in many ways of Russia of the late 90s, early 2000s, where the Iron Curtain has not come down quite yet, but we are entering this transition phase that worries me a great deal, because I am not sure that in this particular case that we will get that second chance that some of my compatriots, and especially my generation and those younger, the Gen Z generation, are hopeful that we will. Not that anything is ever a lost cause, and I am a great believer in second chances, but also in grassroots movements. And I think what we are witnessing in Georgia at the moment is something that I did not really see in Russia when that transition was happening under the early years of Vladimir Putin's presidency. And that is this grassroots movement where the people are trying to drive that change with no political leadership, which on the one hand is a wonderful thing that it's happening at a grassroots level, and it's genuine, and it's not something that the hundreds of thousands of Georgians that some of you may have seen on television that have been protesting for months now, that somehow anyone is telling them what to do. But then on the other hand, the issue here is that because there is no real sort of charismatic, strong political leadership on the other side, on the so-called opposition side, opposing the current pro-Russian regime, is that there is no way to consolidate the sentiment in the streets of Georgia beyond just Tbilisi. And I'm very, very hopeful that it won't be the older generation of politicians that have been in power for a very long time, and for understandable reasons. Many Georgians, the general population, is very concerned to vote for them, because in many ways they are voting for that same machine. Obviously, what's driving them is very different from what is driving the Georgian dream, the ruling regime. But nonetheless, it is time for a new leadership. It is time for that fresh blood, and also the new blood that will drive change, and not top down, but also understand that it is time to listen to the people and to the will of the people, and not just political will. And the one thing, Jim, to your question, that I would share with caution with someone, if we had a time machine back in the day, in the early 90s, when there was so much hope and we had every reason to rejoice and we had so much to look forward to, is that we should not be blinded by the ray of light that you talked about earlier, because the sun will start to set and we may not have enough at our disposal available to us for the next day when the sun rises again. And I think it's very easy for us to overestimate those good moments when we think that this is it, this is democracy. I would have warned them that democracy does not mean having access to McDonald's. It does not mean having access to iPhones, with all due respect to technology. It's far more than that. It's about values. That's something that we cannot impose. It's something that has to be within you, but we all need that guiding hand. And we all need to understand that our friends and our strategic partners are the ones that will be standing by our side. And it's not one of those sort of ephemeral friendships that's here today, gone tomorrow. And I think investing in those friendships, not just the fact that the West has been investing a great deal, not just in terms of funding, but in terms of time and energy into countries like Georgia, my native country, that we also need to do our part as Georgians in this case to invest in these relationships, because there has to be some sort of a transaction, without making this sound like a business sort of a conversation, that we have to have mutual interests. And I think investing in those mutual interests and understanding where the core values are, where we can meet halfway, that's a longer term investment, and it's not about immediate gains.
Well, thank you very much, and also for continuing the sunrise and sunset imagery. Well, Chris, I think that's a great segue to you. From your position, you really have a global perspective on these things, and are able to, I think, take a broader view in some ways, and synthesize some of what you've just heard as well.
So thank you, Jim, for the question, and also for the invitation to be here to talk about this timely topic. I think both Tinatin and Sunny have been extremely eloquent in a whole host of things connected to their countries of origin. But in a way, it's this issue of unmet assumptions or challenging assumptions that were so palpable in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. Some have described the 1990s as the vacation from history, and all that applies. But if you think about it, the opening up of Central Europe, the Baltic states, the unification of the former East and West Germany, all of that happened in very short order. Russia's peaceful dissolution, in a sense, at the time within the larger Soviet context. And so that was an unusual time with hindsight. I think if we could tell one thing to observers at the time, it might be to say, don't view this as necessarily so exceptional, because if we use our same time machine and go back 25 years ago, it would have been right at the point in January of 2000 when Vladimir Putin was assuming paramount power in Russia. It's 25 years, a quarter century, that individual has been in charge of Russia. He took a little hiatus for 4 years when Dmitry Medvedev was prime minister, and then Putin returned. Really worth noting that in 2012, when Putin returned to the presidency in Russia, that's when Xi Jinping assumed paramount power as the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the other titles that come with it in Beijing. And in the spirit of this topic of unlocking cooperation, there's been a lot of cooperation that wasn't anticipated between those two leaders of two very powerful countries that have a very different vision for the world. And when Putin returned in 2012, it was right around the time of the Bolotnaya protests, you might recall. And it's clear with hindsight that Putin used that experience to really start to crush any independent thought, any independent civil society, any independent media, from a start point in 2012 that was already pretty rough, because it was 7-8 years before that where he was already subjugating the main national media in the country, usually in the context of crises that the government couldn't handle, either ships, submarines that had major crises, or major entertainment events where terrorism or other issues were confronted, where the media was then basically suborned in favor of the authorities. So all of this was happening in earnest, I would say, from 2012. And to stay on the topic of unlocking cooperation, I think if we then fast forwarded from that time, basically a dozen years since 2012, 2013, here we are today. We are now in almost the 3rd year anniversary of Russia's full-blown attack on Ukraine, major land war in Europe. That war has been prosecuted, that unprovoked attack on Ukraine by Russia has been prosecuted in deep collaboration with China, Belarus, Iran, that's generating the drones that are attacking Ukraine. And here's the one that nobody had on their bingo card a dozen years ago, thousands of North Korean soldiers on European soil fighting on behalf of Russia against Ukraine. I think our attention spans are so short, we're so submerged in information, there's so much abundance of information today, it's hard to step back and think about how incredible that is. We almost become inured to it. North Korean soldiers are fighting in Ukraine against Ukrainians on behalf of Russia with the support of China, Iran, and Belarus. I should say the leaderships of those countries. And that's pretty remarkable when you think about it. So I can talk about other aspects of such cooperation that defies the conventional wisdom, just about all of the assumptions from 25 years ago in terms of this kind of cooperation where state authoritarian resources are purposed in a very direct and intentional way over a long period of time. Maybe the final point I'll make on this, just as a more general observation. So you think about the leadership in many of the authoritarian countries today, and this is of course true almost by its nature, these sorts of dictatorships, authoritarian systems, their leaders stay by design. They sideline political opposition, independent media, civil society, and they do their best to retain power as long as they're able to do it. So Vladimir Putin has been in power for 25 years. Just give you some examples off the top of my head. In Azerbaijan, Haidar Aliyev was the president of that country until he passed away. His son, Ilham Aliyev, now 22 years ago, assumed power there. 22 years, that's a long time in that small petrostate. A similar version of this has played out in a country like Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez would have stayed for the longer term until he passed away. And now Nicolas Maduro has defied almost all of the conventional analytical wisdom at the time that he would be able to remain in power since the mid-2010s. He's still there with military backing, and he is destroying his country. And he is attacking people who are trying to make that country a better place. By all accounts, he did not prevail in the election. His opponents prevailed. Very courageous people, like the courageous people of Hong Kong and Georgia, courageous people in Venezuela have been showcasing the fact that the incumbent leadership did not win that election. And there's been just brutal violence applied there. And so the point I'd like to finish with is that in these countries where there is not a rotation of power, the ability to see through a certain set of policies is not inevitable, but it can be easier. So I would say, for example, Vladimir Putin, having marginalized alternative power in the Russian Federation and pursuing his program as he sees it over a quarter century, gives him some advantages over democracies which by their nature rotate power and can have dramatically different approaches to the world. This is true across all the democracies from Australia, New Zealand, through Europe, North America. And so I think we need to recognize that in this fight today, it's a fight over values, it's a real struggle. We have to think about ways we don't get caught on our back foot in perpetuity when we think about better ways to respond and cooperate. But maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Well, you know, in all of your answers too, in one way or another, you're talking about the role of individual citizens, of groups, of civil society, and the role of information. And it makes me think about technology. And there was a time also when there was a real optimism about the role that technology could play, and that it could give individuals access to information, could allow them to unlock cooperation in their countries in ways that had not been previously possible. I saw this up close in the time of the Arab Spring, when the Middle East and North Africa was kind of having a delayed response to this time that we had just been talking about, the post-Cold War time. And fast forward, we see an environment where that technology has perhaps been turned on its head, and these kinds of regimes that you were so eloquently discussing, Chris, are using that very technology that was going to be the thing to unlock cooperation, and in fact, locking it down and doubling down on a very sophisticated surveillance state. So, Tony, I know that you've been thinking about this issue. That maybe you could share some of your perspectives on this.
Sure, absolutely. I think everyone since yesterday or 2 days ago is so aware of the Chinese DeepSeek model, right? Perhaps you have one in your mobile right now, right? I think China, is a very good example to see, to argue that how good their technological advancement is. Over the past several decades, perhaps no one could expect China one day could compete or even replace US leadership in terms of the tech world, from all kind of like emerging tech like AI, quantum. So a little bit of my background again. So I'm now in a DC think tank, also focusing on China emerging technologies. So I'm pretty aware of this topic. And I think the terrible and horrifying thing for China is that they really try to integrate all this kind of like emerging technologies into the surveillance state. So when we look at China, they use a lot of like surveillance cameras, and then they use a lot of e-payment system and try to track the citizen of the digital footprint of every citizen in China. And when they solicit this kind of like data, you can imagine they centralize this and go back to Beijing and then for their own purposes. So many people talk about the how amazing DeepSeek is, right? But then no one talk about actually all this data will be sent back to Hangzhou, the place of the DeepSeek, the headquarters of DeepSeek, and then you have no idea how they handle this kind of data. And then this is also related to the overall debate regarding TikTok. Many people talk about should we ban TikTok? Should we try to like this de-risk with TikTok, right? And I think the ultimate argument is that if we don't trust the nature of the PRC government, should they handle the global access of data of every citizen in the world, right? And let me tell you a little bit more. So whenever China try to solicit this kind of data, they will build a massive database and try to use that to advance their AI and try to predict and forecast what is going to happen of that particular individual and try to in order to monitor and surveil the individual behavior. And this kind of action is very horrifying. And I think this is also why it's very important nowadays we talk about AI ethics and AI collaboration. Because if we don't have this kind of like principle in place, we can't really stop this kind of expansion and aggressive exploitation of technology just in the case of China. And I can go on and on because what happened in China doesn't really just stay in China. We also see how China, whenever they develop this kind of like very invasive technology, they try to export that to foreign countries, like ASEAN countries, like African countries, like in America, like in Europe, and all this kind of like technology developed by China, like Huawei and other tech giants, is actually very concerning. And I think we should be aware of that and try to be ready to hold a position and try to develop a framework in order to provide another option more based on democracy, based on human rights, and based on a more responsible use of technology framework in order to ensure that this situation will not escalate further and be worsened.
Oh, thank you very much. Tinatin or Chris, would you like to weigh in on this technology question?
Absolutely. It's very interesting. I was listening to Sunny now, and I thought from the Russian perspective, it's very different, right? Because obviously Russia does not have the technological means that China has. They do turn to China very often, and oftentimes they get the support that they need, but they use technology in a very different way, actually, right? In terms of controlling information and this digital censorship, the digital Iron Curtain that we've seen in Russia, which was a long time coming. I remember when I was working on my master's thesis, it was on the so-called cyber sovereignty of the Russian internet, of the RUNET, and some of the tools that Moscow was going to be borrowing and was already at that time borrowing from Beijing. So this is around 2017, 2018, 2019. And the world that we live in today is completely different, which once again shows us the speed at which everything is developing and evolving. As soon as the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, we immediately started seeing how Russia started to unplug itself from technology, information, trying to go back to the Soviet regime's tools of let's just keep our people in the dark, not fully realizing that actually whatever worked in the Soviet days was not really going to work today just because of how far we've come in terms of technology. So just because an average person is unable to access YouTube, for example, or Facebook and Instagram that are now considered in Russia to be terrorist organizations, essentially, or extremist, as the Kremlin likes to put it. We still have VPNs, and they are still, the people in Russia are still able to access a lot of this information. But what we are seeing that is different is that is also sort of a throwback to the Soviet times, is self-censorship, that fear of even wanting to Google something or use the Russian equivalent Yandex to look something up. A lot of people that I have also spoken with in confidence, they have shared with me that they're worried about Googling certain things that a couple of years ago would have been absolutely benign. I'm very concerned about what that means longer term, because we see cycles. I think Russia as well, and some may disagree, but I think Russia has been through these cycles itself, and inevitably regimes end, and we have those very, very narrow openings every now and then the window and the door and all the other windows start to close again. When that opening is there and when it's available, I don't know what sort of mindset, frame of mind, and frankly, mental and emotional state the people will be in, and whether or not they are going to be able to make the most of that brief window that some were able to essentially take, be able to use for their own benefit in the early 90s, partly because of technology, because of self-censorship, because of fear. And all of these things that would have been unheard of a few years ago, unfortunately, we are reliving that once again, and the repercussions and the implications will, I believe, last far longer than anyone would like to think. In Georgia's case, it is slightly different. I think technology plays a lesser role in this. It's really more about, as I said earlier, grassroots movements that are really taking sort of the front seat in all of this, the individuals' roles that they're able to play. And also, I've noticed that going back to fear and self-censorship, some things that my fellow Georgians are worried about putting online or even sending to each other via WhatsApp, Signal, etc., they are able to discuss these issues and these grievances with each other when they gather during the protests. So they've kind of gone back to the tools that were available to them that they really stopped turning to a few years ago, because everything was about technology and posting this and liking that and sharing something else. And now they're worried about doing that because they're worried about that knock on their door in the middle of the night. Unfortunately, the repressions are back. And instead, they are getting together in large groups, starting to congregate and starting to share grievances and fears and hopes with each other, which is a lot of what happens, by the way, during these protests. We see these images on television and on social media, and some of us probably wonder, well, what are they doing? You have hundreds of thousands of people getting together every evening in Tbilisi and beyond throughout the country. Many of them are using these platforms as safe places and spaces to be able to talk to each other, because they no longer trust technology, and they are, once again, as was the case for their ancestors, they're fearful and worried, and in some cases deeply, deeply concerned about putting anything in writing. So they've gone back to the traditional means of communication.
Well, so what's old is new again.
Exactly.
Getting together and discussing in person is safer than using technology. Chris, anything on this issue?
So maybe just building on some of the observations of my co-panelists, I think we also underestimated the degree to which these authoritarian powers would incubate and road test and innovate technology to help meet what is in their leadership's DNA, which is to say, preventing free speech, free expression, coordination of speech across societies. It's why I and my colleagues focus so much effort on supporting groups and efforts who try to challenge that kind of censorship and break through it. If you think about Xinjiang in China or Tibet, the Chinese authorities have really built what are only understood as highly intensive webs of techno-surveillance. There's been great reporting over the years, places like the Wall Street Journal. Josh Chin and Liza Lin have a fantastic book titled The Surveillance State, where they cover this issue. But then, as Sunny notes, they also explain how there's a methodology to sharing this technology from the PRC outward, really with the wider world. So there's Huawei's surveillance technology in Serbia, which was settled in advance of the protests of disputed elections within the last period. One only wonders the extent to which that technology is leveraged in ways we don't appreciate. This is true. There are lots of examples. My understanding is a fair amount of Chinese surveillance technology has already been adopted in Georgia. So these are things that we need to be mindful of, not because the technology per se is a bad thing. There are many countries that seek out the technology in order to modernize, ostensibly to be more secure or more prosperous. Fair enough. I think one of the big challenges having enough information and breaking through the secrecy that invariably accompanies these deals when China and their home-run companies are operating in different countries around the world. It doesn't take much research looking at how confidentiality agreements, secrecy clauses are baked in to virtually all of the agreements that China has with their partner countries. So I'll just give one quick example on a different topic, which is a big one. So in Kenya, the standard gauge railroad project that China was involved in also was just littered with secrecy clauses. And when civil society, political opposition, and others there have properly tried to get a better understanding of what underlaid that deal, those clauses have been invoked to prevent access to it. This is a systemic thing. This is happening. A-Data, the terrific project based at the University William and Mary down in Virginia, they do terrific work mapping these things at scale. The nature of these deals gets very little attention, but this is something that I would contend can actually reshape the way countries think about basic governance approaches in a pretty fundamental way. Latin America is another good set of good geographical terrain to look at for these kinds of things. Enormous amount of Chinese engagement and investment there. Much of that, including in the tech space, happening in less than transparent ways.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that I think we've learned over the last few decades is that democracy means more than election day. And there was this sense in those optimistic days in the 90s that if an authoritarian regime suddenly started having elections, and if they were some semblance of free and fair, then you had crossed a major threshold and you were basically home free in some sense or another. And we've since learned that all the other things that the three of you were discussing are so vitally important, and they go on before, during, and after election day. That having been said, it doesn't mean that elections don't matter. And 2024 saw a huge swath of the global population go to the polls and vote on elections at various levels in their countries. And in several of these countries, they would by any measure be deemed deeply authoritarian states, yet they're still holding elections. So when we look back on the last year and on the elections in some of these places, elections, I think, are a day that bring together, issues of citizen involvement, authoritarianism, technology, all of these media, they all kind of, civil society, they come together at these times. What sorts of perspectives in your parts of the world or just globally do you have on what we just went through in 2024? And we have more elections coming up in this year. Maybe we'll change the order a little bit. Tinatin, what would you say about elections and where things stand now?
Jim, my biggest concern when it comes to even thinking about elections is the fact that in my part of the world and the broader sort of Eurasian space, many have actually started to, if not accept, at least start to accept normalizing political interference. That many have started to take it for granted, that it's as if, it has always been thus. There will be political interference, every other sort of an interference, and we have to learn to coexist with it because it's not going away anytime soon. That is deeply concerning. I have covered a number of elections in my professional capacity over the years, and the most striking one was the most recent one, again in Georgia, when I noticed that a lot of what would have been deeply frowned upon even a few years ago was suddenly accepted as the norm, that it's the new norm. We have to learn to live with it. Let's learn how to counter it so that we can at least diminish the scale and the intensity of interferences of sorts. But nobody's talking about not accepting an interference of any sort. Some of this is unfortunately a Soviet legacy, in Georgia's case, certainly. Many of my compatriots, especially the older generation, grew up, quite frankly, not believing in voting, in one's vote, in the power of one's voice, because A, they felt that it was meaningless, it wouldn't really count for very much, and B, those who genuinely had some political beliefs, they were very fearful about sharing those beliefs publicly, let alone going to the polls. So when I first became a US citizen, I remember when I was so excited about voting, some of my friends back home that I would tell that I was going to go and vote, not just in the presidential elections, but everything else in between, they sort of looked at me like I was completely out of my mind. Why are you wasting your day going out there and voting when you know that your voice, that one voice, will make no difference? And that is deeply concerning, because I think that, combined with now fear of actually going out there and voting for a candidate, if there is a candidate on the ballot that one believes in, unfortunately, that's a whole other situation. If we talk about Belarus, for example, which I won't get into that now, that is very, very concerning in terms of citizen engagement going forward and what that means. So accepting that political interference is the new norm and normalizing this is very, very problematic for what it means going forward and for what it means for the younger generation who will one day, for better or worse, inherit these political seats, and what it means for the continuation of that sort of a regime going forward.
Chris, I'd like to throw this to you, but let me just also just give a time warning to you and to Sunny, that as we do this last question, because we'd then like to take questions from the live stream audience and also the audience in person.
Great. So elections, of course, are critical. It's, among other things, one of the few tools to understand citizens' preferences. And if you don't have elections, it's very hard to do so. Authoritarian regimes, which either don't hold elections or hold manipulated or shammed elections, use other ways to try to figure out what their societies are thinking and feeling, including today, paradoxically, using technology and their ability to surveil to have a better understanding to the degree they can extract that from data and from communications in the tech domain, probably more efficiently than in the analog era. So that may even argue for more ability to manage and control in authoritarian settings. I think that's a subject of debate. But I think coming back to your original question of whether the promise of technology, where 20 years ago the overwhelming thought in this context, both within and beyond the electoral process, was it's absolutely going to be a good thing because people will be expressing themselves without fear or favor. I think authoritarian regimes have proven very adept at manipulating. As Tinatin alluded to, one of the big changes, certainly of the last decade and a half, is there are just many more opportunities in a globalized environment to engage in political discussion from beyond a country's borders. And one example that has been with us for some time, but I think has really matured, is the emergence of alternative election observation groups, some of which are organized, say, out of Russia. There are a variety, different permutations of this, but they're actually the mirror image in a bad way of the established groups, say, that operate from the OSCE's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which is really understood to be the gold standard for this kind of thing. And these alternative groups emerged over the years, essentially fly in the day of the election, will give a rubber stamp to whatever happened in country X, Y, or Z, even if it's evident that the reality on the ground might belie what they're saying. And then at the same time, they're just as likely to find their voices disseminated on authoritarian state media, both within the country in question, but interestingly, also beyond the country's borders. So it may be that a discussion of an election in Azerbaijan is finding its way to be featured on CGTN or on Sputnik, other places, as an indicator that that country's election met standards. In countries where you don't have free media, where you don't have political opposition that can meaningfully compete, you're not having a free and fair election. And that's true certainly in a systemic way leading up to election day. What the alternative observers will say is absolutely free and open on election day, and hence we give it the stamp of approval. I think that's something for us to reckon with. It's quite different from 20 years ago. How free societies, democratically accountable societies support each other in making sure that election observation in this instance is actually abiding by the UN standards and other established guidelines of rules-based election observation.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a whole nother session that we could have on election observations, and how does an organization like the OSCE, which is driven by the member states, how can they be effective? How can they get access to the other member states and do these election observations, but at the same time not appear to be delegitimized and used by the authoritarian regimes that are just basically saying, well, we need this observation as window dressing or something, but we don't have time for that. So I do want to give an opportunity for Sunny to just weigh in briefly on elections too, and then we'll go to some questions.
Yeah, sure. I think election can mean a lot of things. And for me, I feel like election is kind of like a large-scale sacred ritual that reinforce and consolidate people's choices, dignity, autonomy, and state sovereignty. So a very good example last year is Taiwan. So that's why also China hates Taiwan for organizing election every 4 years, because by every 4 years, when Taiwanese, they uphold democratic principle and they successfully have an election to choose their own country's leader, and then we can see that actually reinforce the practice of democracy, respect people's sovereignty, autonomy, and choices. And this is exactly what Xi Jinping and the leadership in Beijing hate and dislike. So I would say that election is really a good way for people to demonstrate their public will. And usually this is something that we should not take it for granted. We should really protect election. And then we should ensure that election should not be interfered by foreign powers, especially in the case of Taiwan. We see that Chinese, they often, try to threaten Taiwanese. And during the election day, there are a bunch of propaganda, disinformation, political warfare trying to be waged against the Taiwanese to threaten them, not to run for the leadership, not to participate in the election day. I think that's scary, and we should, by all means, try to protect the sacred right for organizing and participating in the election.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, speaking of the voice of the people, why don't we take some questions now? Do we have some online questions?
Hi, sure. I'm Alex Woodson, editor at Carnegie Council. Great question came in from the live stream. How do surveillance practices differ between democratic and authoritarian states in terms of methods, oversight, and impact on civil liberties?
Why don't we just go in order? Chris? Anything
It's a great question. I think fundamentally, these things work best when democratic societies really interrogate the purposes for which surveillance would be used. So it's clear that we live in an era where these technologies are proliferating across all of our societies. They're often used on the basis of enhancing security. Personally, I think that needs to be interrogated as well. Does more surveillance, in fact, deliver more security in terms of crime on the streets and so forth and so on? It can make us feel more secure, and perhaps it is useful in many respects. But I think the main thing I would say is that we need an engaged and educated populace that's asking the right questions, pressuring, letting their elected officials know that they're keeping an eye on these things. And then in turn, optimally, you have elected officials raising questions about the efficacy and the need for these technologies. I would say in contrast to that, and it's a really important issue, there are no guardrails in the modernizing wealthy, in many respects, wealthy at least as relates to their regime's willingness to invest in technology. Certainly the PRC is in this category. I think the Gulf states are in this category as well, certainly Iran. Russia, while as Tinatin alluded to, is maybe not quite at the same level of capacity of China in this regard, but very few countries are. And so, that comparison isn't always the most useful one. I think the Russian authorities, as I understand it, are running as fast as they can to adopt surveillance technology, facial recognition. And that is not for street crime. That's for regime security purposes. And so in those settings, it's really important to have groups on the ground, activists who follow these things closely, who can articulate the dangers to their fellow countrymen and to the wider world as a way to, at a minimum, check and keep some transparency on these things. Because as we've learned, and as we've discussed already, and I think Sunny made this observation kind of apropos of Las Vegas, what's developed in terms of surveillance tech within China doesn't stay in China. And that's not theoretical. We see this now in a large number of countries. There are a number of scholars and analysts and groups that are doing phenomenal work on this topic, and I would encourage those who are interested, take a look. Samantha Hoffman is a good example, really knows her stuff and does great work on this, but there are a number of others too. And so I think we're obliged in this world in which technology really does spread and disseminate from all of our perches to be very mindful of how the technology is evolving and then maybe spreading from the least free settings, because the characteristics and the features of the technology coming from China in particular is something that can also be harmful to our own freedoms.
Thank you. If it's okay, how about if we take another question, and then if you want to circle back to that question too, we can do that. Yes, please. Oh, wait for the mic.
Hi, hello. Thank you for this conversation. Very interesting. My name is Pablo. I am here with the International Students and Scholars Office of Columbia University. I'm from Chile. And I want to broach a subject that hasn't been totally addressed here. It's been kind of addressed, but in my region in South America, almost all countries hold regular elections. It's been ingrained democracy for at least 30, 40 years, thankfully. But during the last years, we're seeing an obvious turn into conservative and populist measures. And the main issue for every country, and I talked of this both on I've studied it and I've lived it, is that wealth disparity and inequality is so huge in the continent that everyone is turning into these leaders that talk to the people, and that they have the solutions for what 40 years of liberal democracy has not been able to achieve, which is produce a really a society in which everyone feels part of the not only voting, but also of the economic wealth of countries. And this has been the main framing also of the election here in the United States, in which the framing of America for the wealth of the people has really turned the election in ways that everyone knows. And populism is verging on this assault direct on international cooperation and collaboration due to this issue. So what do you think about new ways of including the ethics of equity and equality into democracy for it to be really empowered and not be suffering? Because authoritarian states, as has been mentioned here, is a real issue, but also in democratic countries, it's verging into conservatism, populism, and not really collaborating states.
Excellent question. Thank you very much. And you also raised something that we hadn't really discussed directly yet, which is the United States. And I like the way that you raised it, which is to put it into a broader global perspective in the kinds of things that we're discussing here. Tinatin, would you like to address this issue of wealth disparities and inequities?
Well, I think it's a very timely question, one that unfortunately, of course, we don't have that one answer for. And it does vary from country to country. And obviously there are historical ramifications in terms of what the population has gone through in the recent history and the role that history has played in terms of how we think about equity, equality, etc. In the case of Georgia, I can tell you that that is an issue that is on the minds of many, which is perhaps one of the reasons why the ruling regime, the Georgian Dream, was actually able to, whether it's free or fair elections, I think many of us will agree that those were not free nor fair elections in Georgia in October last year, but nonetheless, they were able to remain in power. Though some do talk about the Georgian Dream as a de facto government, but nonetheless. And that is precisely, Pablo, why I think they were able to stay in power, because they did have that camouflage of sorts that they used to show the general population that they were trying to address the bread and butter issues. It was also a government that tried to appeal to those segments of the population that were pining for a populist government rather than an elitist one. So it's sadly not always used. Those issues are not always used in the best way, especially during pre-election and election campaigns. It can often be abused for the political gain of a given candidate. And I'm not entirely sure that any of the political candidates in my country of origin, at least, are thinking about these issues the same way that you are trying to address the issues in your question, that is coming from that place of good faith. I think it's mostly used for political gain, and sadly, as is the case everywhere else, when they do get elected or re-elected, these political powers don't necessarily continue to care about the issues. And that's where one has to be held accountable in a democratic country rather than a semi-authoritarian or an autocratic one, where people will actually hold their government, whom they elected, accountable to address the issues that don't just matter in terms of bread and butter problems in the pre-election campaign phase.
I know we're winding down on time, but Sunny, do you have anything you'd like to add to this topic?
I would just try to bring in another perspective to respond your question. I mean, the rise of populism is also, I think, in response to the so-called failure of globalization. If so, I mean, for many people, I think populists ride on the narrative that for the past or several decades, globalization actually does more harm than good. Because, I mean, many people didn't really enjoy the fruits of globalization. They didn't really enjoy the economic outcome. And I would say, actually, China is part of the reason. With a lot of, state stipend, and then they are flooding foreign markets with cheap labor and then cheap products, and then trying to exploit other foreign labor's worker well-being. And then that actually help the rise of populism, because people feel that, well, whenever we try to do business with China, it doesn't really, we doesn't really gain much. And in fact, when China has a factory, for example, in Africa, I've spoken to many friends from the continent. They also told me, yes, China bring in capital, bring in some new factories and critical infrastructures. However, every China factory, they only hire Chinese people from China. They don't hire locals, and that's a problem, right? And I think this kind of thing should be addressed. So my last point is that I kind of really admire and appreciate the last US Trade Representative, Ambassador Catherine Tai. I think she really set up a very good standard in order to ensure that in the modern era, and when we talk about trade initiative, trade agreement, we have to bring in the element of equality, justice, and all this kind of stuff in the WTO, in the World Trade Bilateral or multilateral trade agreement. So in order to protect the workers, the well-being of individuals, to ensure that the grassroots people can actually enjoy the fruits of globalization, right? So I think this is something we should talk about, and this exactly echoes with the general topic of today. How do we ensure that ethics should be disseminated and delivered to the everyday life of people?
Okay, we'll have time for one more question. I just want to add one thing to your question too, and so just food for thought as you leave. That in some parts of the world, even the word democracy is just off the map, and the sense that it just has not delivered the goods. It is completely delegitimized, and because it hasn't really produced results that are tangible in people's everyday lives. And so the word itself is a non-starter in many parts of the world. So thank you again.
I might just chime in on that. I think it's important to look at the data in these settings. In the main, democratic systems do deliver, according to the data, certainly compared to authoritarian regimes. Do democracies deliver perfectly in every case? Of course not. These systems are comprised of human beings who are contesting ideas and competing in pluralistic settings. But I think we should be very careful not to sweepingly allude to democracy not delivering, even if in instances it doesn't. It's really important to know the context. So countries that haven't been democracies, that are low-income countries, that are struggling to become more democratic, tend to do pretty well in terms of their economic growth for a time. They actually outperform autocracies. Autocracies in certain instances can perform better. China distorts the discussion because it had this growth over a period of time. But when autocracies start to stop delivering economic growth, and their performance legitimacy erodes, you see precisely what's happening in the PRC today. But by the way, also throughout the Middle East and a laundry list of other countries, it's more repression, more censorship, more control of the people. And I don't think that's what ordinary people seek. And so I do think this needs a little more interrogation in terms of what does and doesn't deliver. And that's probably an issue for
That's a whole other session. And for the record, I wasn't saying that I believe that. I'm just saying the perception is there. But you're right, there's great data on this. People like Danny Roderick and others have written extensively on this, yet the perception persists. Okay, how about one last question?
Hello, thank you for the awesome talk. My name is Erode. I'm here with the Borough Manhattan Community College, as well as representing the Lithuanian Alliance of America. And I just recently came back from Lithuania, and one of the main things that I noticed was this sort of omnipresence of Russian soft power, in particular with the Yandex engine. Noticing that they offer a taxi app that's extremely competitive in terms of pricing, becomes really attractive to young people. I noticed that their search engine was also really overpowered, and it's really being pushed in particular to young people. And looking at our recent government elections that were very upsetting to the diplomatic community of Lithuania, young people aren't participating in the sort of governmental process, right? And so they're very affected by this soft power use. And how do you mitigate with this new government that's almost seemingly pro-Russian in some ways and collaborative. How do you mitigate and urge them to notice that this is an issue that we need to stop? Companies such as Yandex, VKontakte, and all that stuff from having access to our young people and not mold them into, unfortunate ways.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's an excellent question. Actually, before our panel, when we were all upstairs, we were talking about soft power and public diplomacy, so you must have been reading our minds. Anybody like to weigh in on this topic?
I'm happy to take a crack at it. So the Baltic states distinguish themselves in the main on these kinds of issues. Lithuania has faced encroachment from Moscow for ages. We're fortunate at the end of the Cold War to regain their independence, as were Latvia and Estonia. But that didn't mean that Russia didn't stop engaging in a wide range of domains in Lithuania, as well as the other two Baltic states, and frankly, the wider region, not just in the information domain, but in many others, cultural and so forth. I would say that the way in which Russia operates, not only in the Baltic states, but in other such places, probably doesn't really fit the definition of soft power. I would call that sharp power for a variety of reasons. Lithuania, I'm confident actually that Lithuanian society and the system will respond really well. They responded, for those of you who haven't followed the Baltic states, Lithuania stood up to the PRC. Lithuania has a population of just under 3 million people, if I remember. PRC is 1.4 billion. Chinese party state brings a lot of resources to bear. The Lithuanians stood up to them. And there was a lot of economic coercion, propagandizing against Vilnius. Incredibly impressive in my view. And so I think whether it's Russia or China, Lithuania is in many respects a model for other democracies to follow. And even with rotations of power in that particular country, I suspect the system will prove to be quite resilient.
I like that hopeful note. Thank you. Any last thoughts on this topic?
Just very briefly to your excellent question, I can tell you that Yandex Taxi is one of the big issues that we're dealing with in my native Georgia as well. That has been a major problem, particularly, actually, interestingly, not so much for the younger generation, but rather the older generation. The first thing they look at is, it's cheaper than the alternative, Bolt. So they will opt for that. And also, once you start talking to them about, Russians and the Kremlin, the government, obviously, not the people, will have access to your data, that sort of just goes over their heads. Whereas when you talk about this to the younger generation, it's a lot easier for you to explain it to them in terms of how it impacts them. So some of this is about critical thinking. Some of this is about countering disinformation, about talking these issues in a way that matters to the general population, where we're not making it sound so complicated that it goes over people's heads. And to your point about soft power versus sharp power, I agree with you completely, Chris. I think the Soviet Union and then Russia thereafter were not so good at soft power. I think we can say that with absolute confidence. And they never really claimed that they were good at it. What does make a huge difference is when the power is sharp and when it's not camouflaged as something soft. It's about instilling fear as opposed to making someone want to be a part of their camp or their group. It's not quite as nuanced as that, I don't think. Soft power did work and I think continues to work better than sharp power in some societies, but not so much in others. And also, it's a generational issue too. So, if we talk about these things openly, and it's really about having conversations for the younger generation, having the conversation about it with their elders, and really explaining why it is that this matters so much, instead of talking about, using the kind of terminology that, as I said earlier, goes over people's heads a lot of the time until they realize what the implications are for them specifically, and not just talking about broader values and broader politics behind it.
Sonny, last word?
Yeah, so I mean, I just try to add on that regarding the soft power part. I mean, so I try to go back to talk about Asia a little bit in response to that to see if there's any comparison you can or lesson learned. I mean, you can draw from. So I would say in the case of Asia, I mean, we talk about China, and then China is a very strong power, and then they have remarkable soft power, hard power, or sharp power. I mean, or every kind of power. And then, but the thing is, I mean, if you really, believe in the very intrinsic value that you try to uphold, and then with the help of technology, I think in the modern era, I will still remain quite hopeful. I mean, for example, nowadays in Hong Kong, even though we face a really significant crackdown, but still, I mean, when you have the access to internet, every form of technology, I think it's still possible and very likely you can disseminate your message well and then across generation. And then I think if you try to uphold the core message well in this way, and then you can also try to be a bridge between the young and the older generation. Because in the case of Hong Kong, we previously also have the problem, like a decade ago, that perhaps the younger people are more pro-democracy. And the elderlies, they like China more, they feel like the heritage there, and then they really, embrace the CCP rule in this way. And then we had a big fight, generation big fight, right? But then, I mean, if you try to do that relentlessly and then try to use a more softer way to do that, I think it's still possible and it's still likely. And then at the end of the day, I still remain very hopeful about the progress of democracy. I mean, of course, there are ups and downs, especially after the Cold War until now. But if you watch at the whole human history evolution and the evolution of the civilization, right? I mean, I think we will, at the end, move to a better place. And then I still remain strongly hopeful about that.
Well, on that note, that hopeful note, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the Carnegie Council for convening these things, to the audience here in person and the live streaming audience. It's been a great conversation, and I hope you continue the conversations immediately following and beyond. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Jim.